High dynamic range images. High dynamic range images. So what about high dynamic range images? The dynamic range ratio between dark and bright regions in the visible world far exceeded the range of human vision and of images that are displayed on a monitor or printed. But whereas human eyes can adapt to very different brightness levels, and most cameras, by the way, and computers, monitors can reproduce only a fixed dynamic range, and photographers, motion picture artists, and others working with digital images must be selective about what important in a sense because they are working with a limited dynamic range. And high dynamic range HDR images open up a world of possibilities because they can represent the entire dynamic range of the visible world because all the values in a real world sense are represented and stored in a HDR image. Adjusting the exposure of an HDR image is like adjusting the exposure when photographing a sense in the real world. And merging images of a different exposures to create an HDR image. And number A is meaning here in this picture now. A is meaning here now image with shadow, image with shadow detail, but highlight clipped, image with shadow detail, but highlight clipped. And B, number B is meaning here now image with highlight detail, but shadows clipped here now, more shadows here sorry. Number C, image C is meaning that image C is meaning HDR image containing the dynamic range of the sense. In Photoshop, by the way, the luminance value of an HDR image are stored using a floating point numeric representation that's 32 byte long and 32 bytes per channel, and the values in HDR image are directly related to the amount of light in a sense by contrast and non-floating point 16 and 8 BPS image files store values only from black to paper white and reflecting an extremely small segment of dynamic range in the real world. And in Photoshop, the merge to HDR Pro command lets you create HDR images by combining multiple photographs and captured at different exposures. And because an HDR image contains brightness levels that far exceed the display capabilities of a standard 24 byte monitor, and Photoshop lets you adjust the HDR preview, and if you need to print or use tools and filters that don't work with HDR images, you can convert them to 16 or 8 BBC images, by the way. Take photos for HDR images. How to take photos for HDR images? How many photos are required to process a quality HDR merge? Again, how many photos are required to process a quality HDR merge? The answer here, types to keep in mind. When you take photos to be combined with the merge to HDR Pro command, you should do the following. Secure the camera to a tripod and take enough photos to cover the full dynamic range of the sense, the scan. And you can try taking at least 5 to 7 photos, but you might need to take more exposures depending on the dynamic range of the scan. And the minimum number of the photos should be 3, by the way. And vary the shutter speed to create different exposures, and changing the aperture changes the depth of field in each exposure and can produce lower quality results. And changing the ISO or aperture may also cause noise or disjointing in the image. In general, don't use your camera's auto bracket feature because the exposure changes are usually too small. and the exposure differences between the photos should be 1 or 2 EV exposure value, and the steps part evaluate equivalent to about 1 or 2 f stop apart, and don't vary the lighting. For instance, don't use a flash in one exposure but not the next, and make sure that nothing is moving in the skin, and exposure merge works only with differently exposed images of the identical skin. So what about features that support 32 BBC HDR images? You can use the following tools, adjustments and filters with 32 BBC HDR images to work with more Photoshop features and convert a 32 BBC image to a 16 BBC and an 8 image to preserve the original image and create a copy with the save as command. And we have many functions here. What about adjustments? Adjustments levels exposure like hue and saturation and the channel mixer and the photo filter, and note and be careful. Also the exposure command can be used with 8 and 16 BBC images and is designed for making exposure adjustments to 32 BBC HDR images, by the way. And blend modes, normal, dissolve, and darken and multiply, lighten and darker color, and linear, dodge and add lighter color, and difference and subtract and divide, and hue, saturation and color, and luminosity. And how to create new 32 BBC documents. If you'd like to create new 32 BBC documents, in the new dialog box, by the way, 32 byte is an option in the by deeps pop-up menu to the right of the color mode pop-up menu. And what about edit menu command? How to edit menu commands? All commands, by the way, including fill and stroke and free transform and file formats. What about the file formats? It's meaning that Photoshop BSD or BSP file format. When you save any picture on Photoshop, the file format will be BSD or BSP, Radiance, HDR, and Portable, Bitmap, BMP, and OpenEXR and TIFF. And note and be careful here again. Also, Photoshop cannot save an HDR image, by the way, in the log-love TIFF file format. It can open only and read a log-love TIFF file. And what about filters? Filters is meaning average box blur, and Gaussian blur, and motion blur, and radial blur, and shape blur, and surface blur, and add noise and codes difference clouds, and lens flare, and smart sharpen, and unsharp mask, and impose, and de-interlace NTSC colors, and high pass, and maximum, and minimum, and offset. So what about image commands, image size? Image command, image size. Canvas size, by the way, image rotation, crop and trim and duplicate, and apply image calculations and variables. And view is meaning pixel aspect ratio, and custom pixel aspect ratio, delete pixel aspect ratio, or reset pixel aspect ratio, like that. And layers is meaning new layers, and duplicate layers and adjustment layers, like levels and like vibrance, hue, saturation, channel mixer, photo filters, and exposure, and fill layers and layer masks and layer styles and supported blends, modes, and smart objects. Many types of layers actually. Okay, and what about modes? Modes is meaning RGB color or grayscale or conversion to 8 bytes and the channel, or 16 bytes and the channel. What about pixel aspect ratio? Pixel aspect ratio is meaning that support for square and non-square documents. And selections is meaning invert or modify border and transform selection and save selection and lose selection. Many selection option. And tools is meaning all tools in the toolbox except magnetic lasso and magic wand and spot healing brush and healing brush and red eye and color replacement and art history brush and magic eraser and background eraser and paint bucket and dodge burn and spong and some tools work with supported print modes only. Many kind of tools really. Okay, what about merge images to HDR? How to merge images to HDR in Photoshop. The merge to HDR Pro command combines multiple images, by the way, with different exposures of the same skin and capturing the full dynamic range in a single HDR image. You can output the merged image as a 32 or 16 or 8 BBC file. However, only a 32 BBC file can store all the HDR image data. And HDR merging works best when photos are optimized for the process. And you should do the following. Do one of the following. Photoshop choose file. Photoshop, then choose file, then choose automate, then choose merge to HDR Pro. And bridge, choose bridge, then select the images you want to use and choose tools, then choose Photoshop, then choose merge to HDR Pro, then escape to step 5. And step number 2, in the merge to HDR Pro dialog box, click browse to select specific images, then click add open files or choose use folder to remove a particular item, then select it in files list and click remove. Step number 3, optional, select a template to automatically align source images if you hold the camera in your hands when you photographed the images, then click OK. Note and be careful, if images lack exposure metadata, enter values in the manually set EV dialog box. And a second merge to HDR Pro dialog box displays thumbnails of the source images and a preview of the merged results. And step number 5, to the upper right of the preview, choose a bit depth for the merged image and choose 32 byte if you want to merged image to store the entire dynamic range of the HDR image 8 byte and non-floating point, and 16 byte image files cannot store, by the way, the entire range of luminance value in the HDR image. Step number 6, to adjust the tonal range, see options for 32 byte images or options for 16 or 8 byte images. Step number 7, optional, to save your tonal setting for future use, choose preset, then choose save preset, then to later reapply the setting, choose load preset. Options for 32 byte images. What is the options for 32 byte images? Move the slider below the histogram to adjust the white point preview of the merged image. Then moving the slider adjusts the image preview only, and all HDR image data remains in the merged file, by the way. And the preview adjustments is stored in the HDR file and applied whenever you open the file in Photoshop to readjust the right point preview at any time. And choose view, then choose 32 byte, then preview options. Note and be careful, the camera raw filter doesn't work, by the way, with 32 byte files in the following: in Adobe Camera Raw 9.10 version and in Photoshop CC 2017. And if you are using one of the above kinds, see the camera raw filters no longer works with 32 byte files. To view workarounds for this issue, option for 16 or 8 byte images. What is the options for 16 or 8 byte images? By the way, HDR images contain luminance levels that far exceed the dynamic range that 16 or 8 BBC images can store. And to produce an image with the dynamic range you want, adjust exposure, and contrast when converting from 32 BBC to lower bit depths. And you have to choose one of the following tone mapping methods. We have many options here now. Local adaptation. Local adaptation adjusts HDR tonality by adjusting local brightness regions throughout the image. And the edge glow. The edge glow radius specifies the size of the local brightness regions, and the strength specifies how far apart two pixels tonal values must be before they are no longer part of the same brightness region. And tone and detail. Dynamic range is maximized at a gamma setting of 1.0. Lower setting emphasizes and mid tones, and while higher setting emphasize highlights and shadows and exposure value reflect F. Stop drag the detail slider to adjust sharpness and the shadow and highlight sliders to brighten or darken these regions. And what about the color? Color vibrance adjusts the intensity of suitable colors, and while minimizing clipping of highly distorted color, and saturation adjusts the intensity of all color from 100 monochrome to 100 double saturation. And what about tuning curve? Tuning curve is meaning displays an adjustable curve over a histogram and showing luminance values in the original 32-bit HDR image, and the red tick marks along the horizontal axis are in 1 EV, approximately 1 F stop, and increments that. So note and be careful here again. By default, the tuning curve and histogram limit and equalize your changes from point to point. And to remove the limit and apply more extreme adjustments, select the corner option after inserting a point on the curve, and when you insert and move a second point, the curve becomes angular, like this screenshot now. And in this screenshot now, number A, tuning curve and histogram adjustment using the corner option. Number A is meaning inserting a point and selecting the corner option, and B is meaning adjusting new point makes the curve angular at the point where the corner option is used. And equalize histogram is meaning compresses the dynamic range of the HDR image while trying to preserve some contrast. Further adjustments are necessary. This method is automatic. And exposure and gamma lets you manually adjust the brightness and contrast of the HDR image and move the exposure slider to adjust gain and the gamma slider to adjust contrast. And highlight compression is meaning compresses compresses the highlight values in the HDR images so they fall within the luminance values range of 8 or 16 BBC image file, and no further adjustments are necessary. By the way, this method is automatic. So what about compensate? Compensate for moving objects. Compensate for moving objects. If images have different content due to moving objects like cars or people or foliage, and select remove ghosts in the merge to HDR Pro dialog box. Photoshop, by the way, displays a green outline around the thumbnail with the best tonal plans, identifying the base image, and moving objects found in other images are removed, by the way. And if movement occurs in very light or dark areas, click a different thumbnail where moving objects are better exposed to improve results. For a tutorial on the remove ghosts option, see this video now, and discussion of remove ghost begun. What about save or reload camera response curves? Save or reload camera response curves. Response curves, by the way, indicate how camera sensor interpret different levels of incoming light. By default, the merge to HDR Pro dialog box automatically calculates a camera response curve based on the tonal range of images you are merging, and you can save the current response curve and later apply it to another group of merged images. And in the upper right corner of the merge to HDR Pro dialog box, click the response curve menu, this button, and then choose save response curve to later reapply the curve. Choose load response curve. So what about convert from 32 bytes to 16 or 8 bytes? If you originally created a 32 byte image during the merge to HDR Pro process, you can later convert it to 16 or 8 byte image, and you can open 32 image in Photoshop and choose image, then choose mode, then choose 16 byte channel or 8 byte channel. Any of those, 16 or 8. Number 2, adjust exposure and contrast to produce an image with the dynamic range you want. And number 3, click OK to convert the 32 byte image anyway. Adjust displayed range of HDR images exceeded the display capabilities of standard computer monitors, and when you open an HDR image in Photoshop, it can look very dark or washed out, and Photoshop lets you adjust the preview so that the monitor displays an HDR image whose highlights and shadows aren't washed out or too dark. And the preview settings are stored in the HDR image file like BSD or BSP and TIFF only, and are applied whenever the file is opened in Photoshop. And the preview adjustments don't edit the HDR image file, and all the HDR image information remains intact. And use exposure adjustment image, then press adjustment, then choose exposure. And to make exposure edits to the 32 HDR image, to view 32-bit, read out in the information panel and click the eyedropper icon in the info panel and choose 32 byte from the pop-up menu. We have many steps. Step number 1, open a 32 HDR image in Photoshop, then and choose view. Then you have to choose 32 byte preview options. Step number 2, in the 32 byte preview options dialog box, choose an option from the method menu. Then we have two options again, exposure and gamma. Adjust the brightness and contrast, and highlight compression, meaning compresses the highlight values in the HDR image so they fall within the luminance value range of 8 or 16 image file. Step number 3, if you choose exposure and gamma, move the exposure and gamma sliders to adjust the brightness and contrast of the image preview, then click OK. And you can also adjust the preview of an HDR image open in Photoshop by clicking the triangle in the status bar of the document window and choosing 32-bit exposure from the pop-up menu, and move the slider to set the white pointer for viewing the HDR image, and double-click the slider to return to the default exposure setting. And then, since the adjustment is made per view, and you can have the same HDR image open in multiple windows, by the way, and each with a different preview adjustment. Preview adjustments made with this method are not stored in the HDR image file. And what about the HDR color picker? HDR color picker. The HDR color picker allows you to accurately view and select colors for use in 32-bit HDR images as in the regular Adobe color picker, and you select a color by clicking a color field and adjusting the color slider, and the intensity slider allows you to adjust the brightness of a color to match the intensity of the color in the HDR image you are working with. And a preview lets you view switches of the selected color to see how it will display a different exposure and intensities. Like this screenshot now. HDR color picker. We have A and P and C and D and E and F and G and H. A is meaning preview area, and B is meaning adjusted color, C is meaning original color, and D is meaning 32-bit floating point values, and E is meaning intensity slider, and F is meaning baked color, G is meaning color slider, H is meaning color values. And display the HDR color picker. How to display the HDR color picker with a 32 image open? Do one of the following. In the toolbox, click the foreground or background color selection box. Then in the color panel, click the set foreground color or set background color selection box. And the color picker is also available when features let you choose a color, and for example by clicking the color swatch in the options bar for some tools, or the eyedroppers in some color adjustment dialog boxes. Choose color for HDR images. How to choose colors for HDR images? The lower part of the HDR color picker functions like the regular color picker does with 8 or 16-bit images, and click in the color field to select a color and move the color slider to change hues, and or use the HSP or RGB fields to enter numeric values for a particular color. And in the color field, brightness increases as you move from bottom to top, and saturation increases as you move from left to right. And use the intensity slider to adjust the brightness of the color. The color value plus the intensity value are converted to 32-bit floating point number values in your HDR document, by the way. And we have steps. Step number 1. Select a color by clicking in the color field and moving the color slider, or by entering HSP or RGB numeric values as in the Adobe color picker. Step number 2. Adjust the intensity slider to boost or reduce the color's brightness. The new color, by the way, swatch in the preview scale at the top of the color picker shows the effect of increasing or decreasing stops for the selected color. The intensity stops correspond inversely to exposure setting stops, and if you post the exposure setting of the HDR image to stops, reducing the intensity stops by 2 will maintain the same color appearance as if the HDR image exposure and the color intensity were both set to 0. And if you know the exact 32-byte RGB values for the color you want, you can enter them directly in the 32-byte value RGB field, by the way. So, step number 3, optional. Adjust setting for the preview area. Preview stop size. Preview stop size is meaning sets the stop increments for each preview swatch. For example, a setting of 3 results in swatches of 9 and 6 and 3 and plus 3 plus 6 plus 9. And these swatches, by the way, let you preview the appearance of your selected color and a different exposure setting and relative to document. It's meaning select to adjust the preview swatches to reflect the current exposure setting for the image. And for example, if the document exposure is set higher, the new preview swatch will be lighter than the color selected in the color pickers color field to show the effect of the higher exposure on the selected color. If the current exposure is set to 0, the default checking or unchecking this option, by the way, will not change the new swatch. Step number 4, optional. Click add to swatches to add the selected color to the swatches panel, then click OK.